we have a name that some of you might be familiar with, at least the company name, Chainalysis. But it's an absolute pleasure to be able to invite Philip to the stage, because Philip is someone that actually does have some philosophy over the space. Yeah, so please welcome Philip. This is your clicker, and we'll do Q&A afterwards.
Amazing. And I guess I need a mic.
One of these ones, sorry.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Philip. I'm from Chainalysis, which, for those of you who don't know, is the Great Satan. For those who take a slightly different view, it's a company that provides blockchain analytics to law enforcement, governments, crypto businesses. And I'm the chief economist there. And that really means I've just been there for a long time and done a lot of different things. And today, as Jonathan said, I kind of want to give a bit of a philosophical view on what the debate is between privacy and compliance, bringing in that experience that I've had over the last 6 years. I'm just going to start almost with some basics and then go into the implications of that, right? Blockchains are transparent. It means that we can see all the data. They're anonymous. It means that if I generate a wallet, it's really hard for someone else to connect that with me. But then the crucial bit that I'm going to get into is that blockchains are actually really used by services, right? Businesses, exchanges, smart contracts. And they're actually not anonymous. We know the name of this smart contract. We know the addresses this exchange uses. And they have responsibilities. And it's really the confluence of these three different things, that transparency, that anonymity, and the responsibilities of services that I think creates the real debate around privacy and compliance. So that's really my question. What is the balance between these two things? And I should say, I do think it's a balance. You can be very absolutist about this and be like, privacy, absolute right in all cases, can debate that as well. But I'm really thinking here about some of the trade-offs that people have made in reality to try and make this work. So, transparency. And, a little bit of a philosophical presentation, so there's going to be a decent amount of text. So sorry about that. But with transparency, what it really means is that everything can be seen, right? All of the transactions that are made on a blockchain are on the blockchain. The big issue is you have to know what to look for. And that gets kind of hard because there's now a new layer 1, there's a new layer 2. People just bridge across this, they go across that. There's loads of transactions. It takes a remarkable amount of effort and human-in-the-loop work to go and actually sift through that and understand what's important. So that's the first thing about transparency. Yes, it's all there, but you've got to know where to go and look. The other thing about everything being on the blockchain is it actually reduces everything to a math problem. And that's kind of important. When you have complete information, it means that if you've got a big enough computer and a smart enough algorithm, you can kind of go work anything out. It also means things like zero-knowledge proofs are really important because they're also a math problem. They're much harder to get information about. But the problem, again, is that everything needs to be human understandable. Great, you can get a computer to go work everything out, but if there is a compliance situation, it's pretty much always a human compliance officer or a human customer or a human court that needs to decide something. And that means that all of these arguments we can have about data and technology go back into a very human process, right? There are people who have to make decisions, and they do that based on all of their experience and ethics. And so it's really important to understand how crypto actually connects into that. And then the final big implication on the transparency is that it means that basically, and Frank touched on this just before, source and destination of funds checks basically equals compliance. That is what compliance means in very practical terms on the blockchain. Do you know where these assets came from? Do you know where they're going to? With things like scams, it can get more complicated, but source and destination of funds checks is the basis of crypto compliance today. And if you do want to learn more, there's actually a book about this called Traces in the Dark, which explains the journey of blockchain analytics. So just giving a little pitch for that. So that's transparency. What about anonymity? And look, I spent 6 years in a blockchain analytics company doing quite a lot of the deep work there sometimes. And I can say that anonymity for individual wallets is actually really good. Like, it's actually really hard to know, at least by looking on the blockchain, that this address is controlled by a specific individual. I'll come to when that information does get revealed, but fundamentally, that anonymity works. It's important, though, to realize that that generates a privacy of who you are and not a privacy of what you do. Because on the blockchain, right, you can see where everything is going, and so you don't have that privacy of what you do. But who you are, that's actually pretty strong. The challenge is that privacy for all of this starts to reduce when on-chain activity is kind of joined with other layers of activity, right? So I put my, wallet address on my social media handle, right? I join that with my ENS name. Or I do KYC at an exchange. Or, I don't know, there's a lot of different ways in which, the human bits of on-chain data can start being joined with other layers of information. And there are so many other layers of information. Like, if you start thinking about internet privacy more generally in the Web 2 world, like, there are data brokers, they have big databases of information, they've been compiling big pictures of people for years now. So that's what I mean when I say there are other layers, right? And people go, hey, how can we actually join this on-chain data with that? That is something that happens like out in the world. It's actually not something that happens in blockchain analytics because the question is actually about how do funds flow from one service to another, and also partly because other people can go out there and join those data together. It's not actually something that's kind of like a core speciality of a blockchain analytics company. And you'd be surprised at how important being focused on your business problem is to actually operating. Determines a lot of what you actually end up doing. So anyway, that's anonymity. So what about services? Okay. And this is potentially like a different area that people don't think about, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time through this talking about why I think this is actually where the debate is. Okay, so services, they're like platforms, right? Open to send and receive crypto with a third party in exchange for a good or service. Just a bit of a definition. You're kind of building a business to do something. So that's your, your liquidity pool, your exchange, your merchant service, even your darknet market, right? And the key thing is that when you offer a service, you are expected to know your counterparties and check their source or destination of funds. That is, if you like, your license to operate. It's why once you start doing something that has a third party involved, you suddenly get these responsibilities. That's often like a legal expectation. It's sometimes a social expectation as well. But that exists. And you can't really get around it once you start doing things on other people's behalves. And services, final point there, is they are typically where all these different layers of activity get joined. So I have to give up my KYC information if I want to go and use a service. That's kind of like a trade-off I'm making, and now I make a deposit into that service, and you get that end of the thread, right, that could then be pulled on chain, and that's connected to an identity. So that's kind of how that services come into this privacy debate. So that's just like a little bit of almost definition, and for me that generates two very practical privacy compliance questions. The first is, well, what if the source or destination of funds just can't be traced? Does that mean that we don't have a problem here? And the second question is, well, what if compliance responsibilities do not or just cannot apply to me? Right? Because if we want to maintain privacy, we're basically saying we don't really want to know where these funds are from or where they're going to. We're going to give our users that privacy. So if we can't do it, then that's cool. We can maintain that privacy. Or if I'm just not responsible for knowing, then I don't need to go and ask. And that's why I think these are the two kind of crucial, very practical privacy questions. It's what privacy sort of transforms into questions around this. And obviously, first spoiler alert, source and destination of funds can often be traced, right? It's just, you can do it. You can do it on blockchains, and you can do that way better than you can in fiat systems. This is from a Chainalysis crypto crime report. We publish it every year, and this is the destination of illicit funds. And the fact that we can produce this kind of chart, people like regulators don't like crypto. Yeah, they do, because you can see this, and you can understand where this illicit activity is going to and from. And just to a point that was made earlier, where do people tend to cash out. This big blue part, it's exchanges. It actually typically is into a small number of addresses, typically into those nested services that were mentioned before. And so we can really get into the granular detail of where these funds come from. But what about mixers, right? They actually break that source and destination of funds. In the previous chart, there was a little bar that was the funds that came from mixers. Well, where did those funds come from? Now, mixers, do break that source and destination link, right? I'll go into some times that they don't, but that's kind of what their business model. But we can see what comes into them, and we do see that quite a lot of illicit funds goes into mixers. It's not the only place, like I said. A lot of it will go into exchanges, but people do send illicit funds into mixers. Then we can also see where the mixers, send their funds afterwards, and a lot of that goes into exchanges. And so if you're an exchange and you're receiving this inflow from a mixer, you can ask yourself, do I want to have this as my counterparty, given they can't tell me where these funds come from? And exchanges are increasingly feeling a little bit wary about that, and increasingly regulators are saying, well, maybe if you're an exchange, you shouldn't accept a mixer or funds coming from a mixer as a counterparty. And that's a really interesting problem, right? Because I'm, trying to provide a privacy-enhancing service, but now people, do they have to accept me as a counterparty if I'm providing that? What forces these exchanges to be open platforms, right? To accept deposits from all sources? Do they have a right to say no if I want to enhance the privacy of my users? It's a big, important question. The other thing about mixers is you've got to think about the privacy set, right? This is Where's Wally? The game I used to play as a kid. Maybe it's why I ended up in crypto, because I thought this type of thing is fun. And you've got to find this one character, right? And you start on the first page of the book, and it's really simple. There's Wally and 2 other people. You found him, good. And then by the end of the book, there's 1 million people on there, and it's much harder. And this is just basically how, in very practical terms, privacy works. Best privacy you can have is to hide in the crowd, right? If you are depositing funds into a mixer and you're the only person depositing funds into a mixer, you're going to be the only person withdrawing funds from a mixer. Or if you're the only person using Monero, you're going to be the only person using Monero. And the big question, if you want to maintain privacy, is, well, how big can I make that privacy set? And that means you've got to make things mainstream, and to do that, you've got to say, have funds from your privacy-enhancing solution be accepted into exchanges. Because what do people want to do? Go trade on exchanges. And so you do face this real trade-off, right, between getting lots of people in to maintain that privacy and being accepted everywhere. The other thing I should say about this debate is that, there's increasing sophistication, right? So literally last month or last couple of months, in the Bitcoin fog case, was the first time that blockchain analytics was actually court-admissible evidence. Before then, while law enforcement would use blockchain analytics software to follow the funds, they would have to do what's called parallel reconstruction, where they would then have to go and basically connect all the UTXOs without any of the labeling or tooling that blockchain analytics provides. Now, that has been accepted, at least for Chainalysis. I'll give the shout out to that. And that's why there was a mention earlier of, look, a lot of the effort goes on to labeling and being really sure about that. And actually that misses out a lot of things that are probably illicit. Well, that's because probably doesn't count here, right? Here you need some real certainty. But that is an important step. I kind of bring this up to say, if you're thinking about breaking that link between the source and destination of funds, there's increasing sophistication is now almost allowed as court-admissible evidence to trace through that. So the game has got harder. And that's a really common thing in privacy, right? Privacy is kind of in this constant battle between surveillance and privacy. We've seen that all throughout history. And there's now been an upgrade in the sophistication on the surveillance side through this court case. So that's, what if you cannot trace between the source and destination of funds? And really I'm saying, in most cases, you can. So now becomes a question of, well, what if compliance responsibilities do not or cannot apply to me? I'm going to do not first. Spoiler alert, they do. Just some very simple compliance golden rules, right? And this is not legal advice, I think I had to put that up there. But really, if you are setting up a crypto business, you have two fundamental responsibilities on the compliance side. Do not allow North Korea to launder your funds, and do not lose or steal your customer funds, okay? If you do that, then you are doing pretty well on compliance in crypto, and that is your minimum. And but seriously, I think when people kind of go, oh, I don't want to set up my crypto business because there's a lot of regulation, I'm like, do that, and then you're probably going to be okay. You can do better than that, and that's nice, but this is the basic responsibility. So, what if compliance responsibilities cannot apply to me? And this, I think, is a fascinating question. And people think they answer this question by decentralization. They say, I'm decentralized in my service, and therefore there isn't a person who is responsible for this. And there is not a good answer to this, but honestly, the main answer at the moment is that you are actually not decentralized, or even that decentralization is not enough. And just to be philosophical for a moment, our society, certainly all our rules and regulations, operate on the principle that there is a natural or legal person, i.e. a physical person or a business, that is responsible for things, because few things just, get created. Bitcoin is basically the only one, maybe Jesus. For everything else, there is something behind it. And understanding that is a really important question. So I said it's a philosophical debate. So here's a bit of text. Responsibility still exists within decentralized systems, right? And it's broader than just decentralization. And these are just some principles that I think about. They're not the rules, as it were. But actually, what is the degree of centralization? Is there a single entity that can control things, or even change the control in the future, right? You may be like, hey, my system's decentralized, but I've still got the private keys, and I could change it in the future. That's not, that's going to be a problem. But it goes beyond decentralization. Economic interest. It may be decentralized, but are you making money out of it? Do you hold a big bunch of governance tokens, and you profit from actually more and more people using this service? If you do, some people could argue that you have responsibility. I'm not saying you definitely do, but they might come down that route. Third one, proximity to the user. So I think a good way of explaining this concept is, internet service providers are not responsible for the hate speech that goes through their servers as a packet when it's said, say, on Facebook. But Facebook might be, because they have a proximity to the user, right? And so this idea that there is a technology stack, and as you go down that technology stack, the sets of people that you deal with kind of get bigger and bigger. You are going to be less responsible for what flows through your technology than if you're at the very top of that technology stack and you're only serving the set of people where the bad things happen. These are just some principles, but this is actually what the policy debate looks like, right? People go, how decentralized is something? Actually, decentralization isn't quite the right point. Maybe there are these other things that attach responsibility to people. And because every presentation needs to end with some AI, I got a serious point to make here. For me, privacy is really, this balance between privacy and compliance is actually about who is offering a service and how responsible for something are they. And what we see on blockchains with decentralization is a genuine diffusion of responsibility. And people go, what happens when an AI starts making decisions? Who's responsible for that AI? How the hell do I think about that? Well, we actually have decentralized systems, especially in Bitcoin and in Ethereum, that just operate, and no one can actually really go and affect them. There really is decentralization going on there. And so how we think about responsibility there is going to help us think about responsibility when we have AIs going and doing a whole bunch of stuff, potentially doing it on a blockchain as well, just to square the confusion. So just to kind of really summarize, I think my argument is that the privacy versus compliance debate really becomes pointy when we're thinking about the services, okay? I'm a service provider. and I want to maintain the privacy of my users. Individual privacy on the blockchain, it's like pretty good as long as you're happy with privacy of who you are, not necessarily what you do. And when it comes down to, hey, I want to maintain the privacy of my users as a service, well, first of all, like, how happy, how comfortable are you with doing source or destination of funds checks? And if you're happy with that, then you're great. If you're not, your question is, well, how much responsibility do I actually want to take on behalf of my users? If I'm not doing the source or destination of funds checks for them, I actually kind of become responsible for the source or destination of funds that they were choosing to use. That's because I risk becoming a money launderer. And if I do that, if I'm going to preserve their privacy and take on that responsibility for them, well, am I okay with some people saying, I don't want to work with you, I don't want you to be my counterparty? And the second question to think about is, well, actually, how diffuse is your responsibility? If you're designing a decentralized protocol, are you actually designing it so that that responsibility really is not yours? And are you happy with some of the consequences that come from that? So hopefully, this has kind of been a little bit of a journey to kind of see how we go from like these facts of a blockchain, anonymity, transparency, the use of services, into a very practical question that you might face if you are developing a service. So yeah, looking forward to some questions.
Cool. Thank you very much, Philip. We can take a seat because we're also going to do a panel with you on in a minute as well. If we can change over to the Slido, we have some questions. The most upvoted one right now is, the more you abide by their rules, the more rules they'll have, and the tighter they'll be on you. What do you think about that?
I actually, look, there's the kind of radical vision, right, of going like, hey, these rules don't make sense, and I'm trying to build a system that exists outside of them. And I think that's like, actually, like, hey, you worked at Chainalysis for 6 years. Is that really your view? I'm like, yeah. And maybe when we get to the fun facts in the next round, I can explain why. So like, look, go and be like, hey, I want to build a system that has a different set of rules. You'll have rules in that system, right? But that's like the thing that you're doing. If you want, however, to make a living offering like trading of crypto, then you are living in someone else's system. And so if you don't go and play by those rules, then actually that's when things get tighter, right? If you let, like, the way to get number one on the list of things regulators are upset by is like launder money for the North Koreans. And that's an example of not allowing any of the rules to apply to yourself. If you do that, that's actually how you get to the top of the list. What's the next?
That's the answer that's the answer you're going to get. The next question is, why are you going off against the US legislature and regulations? Perhaps other countries have a word to say.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think, honestly, it's what I've tried to bring in here is like the practical reality. And the practical reality is that the US does set the standard for compliance. And it largely does that through enforcement, right? You do something wrong and they will come after you. And like, it's not how the Europeans work. And Europeans eventually got there with Mika. But like, so, yes, you can have this kind of debate almost philosophically, but the reality is the US has been setting the tone. And that's why there's that focus.
Yeah, unfortunately. Next question is, and I think this is the first time during the entire event where someone's put a name, and so it's from a North Korean perpetrator. Is it just North Korea that is blacklisted, or perhaps Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Russia? Who to determine and create that list? Perhaps the hegemon behind you.
Yeah. And I think so actually, like, back in 2018, we were like, I basically had like an internal debate in the company, did like a little survey. And we asked people, like, what we found when we did this was like, what do you think of our software? Like, what do you think of its impact in the world? And the thing that people were mainly worried about was actually which countries had access to the software. And you're like, that is interesting. Like, how do we handle that? And like, there aren't really that many good choices of like a system that you can ascribe to say, hey, these are people we like and these are people that we don't like. And where you end up is realizing that, it's a little bit binary, right? You're either a US-aligned company or you're not a US-aligned company. And if you're not a US-aligned company, then, you don't get to live in Amsterdam or get venture capital funding or have a very big business. And so those are definitely choices that you make. And they became much sharper when you get things like Russia invading Ukraine. And you're like, hang on. We have to make like business decisions on this weird great powers stuff that I thought was like something that happened in history. But it's true. Like, so you can kind of go, great, North Koreans are on the naughty list, but should Iran? What about Venezuela? And I'm like, I don't actually have great answers for you, but I do know that there's basically a choice, that you're in some sense US aligned or you're not.
Yeah, it's geopolitical. It's fucked up, for lack of a better way of putting it. So just as an FYI, it is officially 12 o'clock, which means that the hackathon has closed. So that is where, like, when you're leaving this and having lunch, like, please go and speak to the hackers and everything. And I hope they're going to be relaxing for a little bit. But just know that there's a lot of people that have just worked for a really, really long time. And so I hope that you get to enjoy also their presentations and stuff later. So we're going to do, two more questions, and then we're going to invite the next panel to the stage. So the next question is, good luck. Which checks are in place to not have one-sided expert testimony in Chainalysis, given its importance in court? Are their competitors also accepted?
I'm like maybe not the best person to talk about it, but I'll try. Just because I'm not in the part of the business that does all the expert testimony. But yeah, I mean, other blockchain analytics providers did give views in those cases, and they were like considered, and some of them were rejected. So like anyone is free to put in their viewpoints, and that does happen. Like people submit like a bunch of evidence for this, and you can like attach notes to the trial and so on, and a bunch of people did. I guess what we don't really see is, like how to put it. It's kind of an expert community, right? Everyone's kind of doing roughly the same thing. And so there aren't really people always from outside of that community trying to go, hey, is blockchain analytics the right thing to do? Like, I'll admit, like, that's missing. So, like, that would be kind of a cool civil society thing to do.
And the last question I'm going to take, and of course we've got to take this one, is it's funny to hear from Chainalysis that they're in favor of privacy. It's the same thing as having sex in the name of virginity. So I guess like what I want to preface with this is the fact that I think that's exactly why it was important to have Philip here to talk about this exact topic. That's what I'll say.
I mean, I think like, yeah. I mean, I don't really. The thing I think that I want to emphasize is that there is this big, like, social process that sits behind this, right? It's not like you provide data, you provide software, you provide training, but then that is taken by a group of individuals in a compliance team or in a law enforcement department, and they apply a lot of their own thoughts and processes and ethics and rules and regulations to it. And sometimes they do things that people don't like, and sometimes they do things that people do like recover stolen funds. And, you know, the fascinating thing, the thing why I'm still there 6 years later, is because that, like, debate doesn't go, right? There is always that battle. And, like, for me, I say privacy is a balance with compliance. And, you know, technology has kept raising the stakes. You know, we have more and more privacy than we've ever had before. If you can send encrypted messages on your phone. I remember trying to send encrypted emails to people like 20 years ago. It was really, really hard. And now I can do it like automatically. And that, in a sense, works in our social contracts because also surveillance has kind of got better as well. And I'm really happy and comfortable being, you know, a part of that process and that debate.
Cool. Well, please give it up for Philip.